First of all, let's do a brief recap on the previous episodes. The myths in particular are a lot more detail in those episodes, so check out them if you are interested in knowing a lot more about those myths, because they really are quite fascinating. So let's start with the recap of the earlier episodes. Prince Khaemwaset, son of Rameses II. This guy is so incredibly interesting. Today, he is recognized as the first Egyptologist because of his contributions to preserving and studying ancient Egyptian monuments. And most interesting of all, he was not buried in his own tomb. A fake body was created from old Apis bull bones. His role as high priest gave him access to ancient knowledge and wisdom that enabled him to find things that others could not. They say that he enlarged the Serapeum, creating this amazing underground gallery, which permitted many burial chambers for Apis bulls within the one structure. He is also known for the restoration of other famous sites. There are lots of very intriguing stories about him, and even theories that he was a magician. The first story, he finds a book of magic written by Ptah. He returns the book to the tomb where he found it, but not until he's read it, obviously. So now the spirit of the tomb asks for a favor. They request that he go in search of the remains of the spirit's wife and children. The second story is called Setne Khamwas. Our hero has a son who they name Serapeum, and he turns out to be an incredibly talented magician and likes to teach his father things. And at one stage in the story, he takes his father to visit the dead in the land of the Duat. The most interesting part of this story is when the king is being challenged by another kingdom called Nubia. Basically, the story goes along the lines of, my magicians are more powerful than your magicians, na. And the magicians of the pharaohs were challenged in a way that they were indeed stumped. And so the pharaoh looked to his brilliant brother, Setne Khamwas, our hero of the story, to sort it out. He had absolutely no clue, but he had his brilliant son, the one that had taken him into the Duat, into the land of the dead. And his son, he looked to him to solve this problem. And the problem, or the puzzle, relates to the contents of a letter. And the child reads the letter remotely, and Egypt wins the challenge. The son confesses to who he is. The magician disappears. Well, that's what magicians do, don't they? So that's the extremely abbreviated recap. But by this stage, you will no doubt be wondering, what happened to his body? Did he die or just disappear? You might also be wondering, what did he find in all his excavations of these many sites? And why was his death mask so poorly made and look so unlike him? Did he create the Serapeum, or did he merely find it? Did the Egyptians really believe in magic? But moreover, did they actually have magic, or was it residual technology from a much older epoch? Before I discuss all these questions and what I actually think, let's just have a quick look at what the evidence is that is available currently. So far, what we do know that the Egyptologists of today would not dispute are, number one, there are myths of magic that surround him, and most importantly, he is linked to the Book of Ptah that contained magic and secrets, but they don't consider that to be truth, just to be myth. So that's all. Number 2, he was involved in many what we would call excavations and restorations of much more ancient sites. I mean, we're talking over 3,000 years ago here. And that's why he is today called the first Egyptologist. But from my perspective, it was clear that he was actually searching for something, and he clearly knew where to look. Number 3, he was not buried in his own tomb. A fake body made up of bull bones, Apis bull bones to be specific, was used to create it. And Egyptologists even found the mummy, and they unwrapped it, and they found that it was bull bones. And they have confirmed this. Number 4, his father was Rameses the Great. And that's according to the various statues. And if you're interested in anything to do with Rameses the Great, you will know that there are numerous statues and amazing, amazing things related to this pharaoh. And number 5, as I've mentioned before, he's reputed to have created the Serapeum. Number 6, he was a high priest of Ptah. And even the Egyptologists would agree that this gave him access to the inner circle of ancient Egyptian secret knowledge. Things we learn about the ancient Egyptians from Khaemwaset and the myths around him are the ancient Egyptians believed in reincarnation, or at least they believed it was possible, since the magician/wizard was returned from the dead to be reborn as the son of Khaemwaset. And this I agree with. Another point, they believed in an afterlife in the duet. Yes, obviously they did. They also believed in earthbound spirits. Well, yes, but why they believed this requires a bit more explanation. An example of this from today's world is the statue of Sekhmet that seems to have the ghost of Ptah with her. It is residual technology, the equivalent of like a recording, but I can explain that in a lot more detail if anyone is interested. And another point, they believed in the equivalent of heaven and hell, and that bad deeds would not go unpunished. So weighing the bad deeds against the good deeds. That's when you see the heart being weighed against the feather. And that's not a bad thing to believe in my opinion. Another thing they believed was they had magicians, or maybe you'd call them wizards, and gosh, yes, they did, but this is a massive subject. I simply can't do it justice because a quick explanation just wouldn't do it. I'm sure from my other episodes you will probably have pieced together some of my explanation around Egyptian magic, but needless to say, a lot of it is either superstition or residual technology. But I can get into that in a lot more detail if people want me to do another episode on it, or you can even go back and check out some of the other episodes which do actually touch on this. So magic was real to them, and they didn't consider it a trick. So like today we think of magic as being some kind of amazing trick that we'd love to know how they did it. But in Egypt, no, it wasn't considered a trick. And to them, it was real. But as I said before, it was technology. How does all this compare to what I've seen of ancient Egypt in my dream regressions? Well, first of all, my regressions cease at about the time of Akhenaten. And so Rameses II, i.e. Rameses the Great, and Khaemwaset came after that time. But there are some things about their story that doesn't matter that I wasn't there at that time. It's fairly easy for me to extrapolate. I can confirm that the ancient Egyptians were fascinated by the much more ancient sites, not just the sites of their ancestors, but also the sites of, for lack of a better word, the before time. They were constantly searching for anything that was left behind from the before time, and it was such a strong fascination that many pharaohs would reward people handsomely for anything they found from the before time, and the pharaohs were often buried with these artifacts, and combine that with a developing ability to replicate many of these items in a softer stone type in order to get paid for finding the ancient items, but they weren't really, they were fakes. And I do an episode which actually addresses this as well. But finding and restoring and reusing ancient sites was in fact very common. It was a project of joy for any pharaoh. It was believed that returning a site to its former glory would elicit great favor with the gods. They were also very pleased with the things that they found at these sites, some of which they considered to be magic. The before-time sites had no writing on them, but they were sometimes had diagrams or information of a non-writing form, but any books that they found were actually stone tablets, and these were mostly unreadable to the ancient Egyptians. It's a pity none of these seem to have survived, or maybe they have survived and they're in private collections. In my opinion, Khaemwaset was what we would call today a tomb raider for the pharaoh. But this wasn't considered to be a bad thing then, but rather it was part of a process that included the restoration of sites. The high priests had access to information that helped them to find these more ancient sites, and their duty to the gods was a very significant motivation which made them want to do this and to restore and reuse these old sites. And the Serapeum is a perfect example of this. In my opinion, based on what I've seen in my dream regressions, the Serapeum was in fact found by Khaemwaset. It was renovated and enlarged, and stone boxes found from other sites were moved into the location for the purposes of having one large mortuary for Apis bulls. In my dream regressions, I have seen another level below the level we're familiar with at the Serapeum, which was accessed through a shaft in one of the chambers. But that also is another story. And it's obvious that that shaft hasn't actually been found yet. And I think I recognized the wall where it might be when I was actually in the Serapeum. It just looked familiar, and I do have some very clear memories of the Serapeum. When I was at the Serapeum, it was obvious to me what parts of the Serapeum were from the before time and what parts were add-ons by the dynastic Egyptians. Some of the stone boxes they found were for storing chemicals or minerals, etc., while others were for storing technology. But the ones I speak of the most are the ones that stored things required in case there was a disaster. I've covered that in detail in other episodes. The information, the resources, tools, etc. And you will have heard me refer to them as restarter kits. So, back onto the topic. What do I think happened to Khaemwaset? Well, I think that Osiris returned for him. It's very clear from the myths that the two were very close. And since there was no body, I think he simply departed with Osiris. But his fellow priests had to cover this up and created a body, and they had a ceremony for his entombment. The poorly created death mask was because they didn't have his body to make the death mask from. So this leads to the next question. Who was Osiris? Well, to me it's obvious that he was an Atlantean. And here's where it gets a bit complicated. I believe, based on my dream regressions, that there were many Atlanteans that, let's say, stuck around in ancient Egypt. Some formed a secret society that were essentially stonemasons that created the amazing statues which were done on commission for the pharaohs. But they got paid not in gold, but in the artifacts and items from the before time. The pharaohs just assumed that this secret society had some sort of magic going for it, And they were doing this work with this magic that they knew, but they were essentially just ordinary people. That's what I think the pharaohs believed. But yeah, that's not the case from my dream regressions. Anyway, so that's a separate group to the Atlanteans, who the ancient Egyptians considered to be gods, and they communicated with them. So although initially the communications were with a group led by Tehut, otherwise known today as Thoth or Hermes Trismegistus, the communications were using statues. An example of this technology, you'll need to refer to my episodes on the Ark of the Covenant. After Tehut passed away, communications mostly ceased with that group, and they were then, to some extent, taken over by a different group that was led by Japé. Only a few of the communication statues were linked to the people of Uran. So Uran and Tehut were in cahoots. The ones controlled by Japé were, well, let's say not so nice. They were encouraging wars, they wanted animal sacrifice, and they were into a lot of other unpleasant stuff. But that too is another story. Whoever Osiris was, I'm fairly confident that he was one of the good guys, one of the followers of Uran. The final question regarding if the Egyptians really believed in magic is very interesting, because that is extremely obvious just from reading their myths. But moreover, they did actually have magic. And from my perspective, that was residual technology from a much older epoch. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I think Khaemwaset ended up becoming one of the immortals and joined up with Osiris and went to live with the followers of Uran. But that's purely speculation on my part based on what I've read about him. So I can't guarantee that that's the case. So that's the end of the episode, and thank you for listening.